Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Free Speech Forward for another one of our sub-series that is intermittent whenever we kind of feel the need to hop on and talk through an issue that we feel is pertinent and related to free speech. And this is one where I really have to give all of the kudos to Chris. As someone who majored in English, did all of my graduate school work in English, taught English classes, I have to say I am absolutely thoroughly impressed by the linguistic framework that you stumbled upon. I'm assuming you stumbled upon. I don't know
I
what
did.
stroke of genius you had for this topic today, but Shakespeare would be proud. So I am officially giving you the unofficial Shakespeare Poetry for Free Speech Award for the topic you came up with for our chat today, because this is the topic of the important, crucial distinction between censoring and censuring. And so in this ing form, it really is only the difference of one little letter, the O
Mhm.
versus the U, between censoring versus censuring. But as we're going to discuss, there's a very significant real world difference that is worth the discussion here. But I'm going to turn it over to you because I even want to hear the backstory of how you even came to this distinction, and then start to hear it in your own words how you developed this really crucial idea.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I'd like to thank my parents for their upbringing. I'm really
And the
humbled by this
Academy.
award and the Academy. So thank you for that. And yeah, I was gonna, just by way of introducing our brief topic here, was gonna give that background because this is now the second of our hot takes for any of you who tuned into our first one. And if you recall, in that first one, we really kind of even the inspiration for this entire sub-series came from the horrible murder of Charlie Kirk, one of the foremost free speech advocates and liberty leaders in America. And we wanted to react to it. And we used that first hot take episode to examine these really long, but we both thought very good tweets on X that explored this concept of the legal regime of free speech versus the culture of free speech. And it was in the context of the just raging debates and reactions to Charlie's murder going on at the time. And then, kind of efforts by many activists online to get people who were celebrating Charlie's murder censured or suffer some type of consequences. You could say it canceled, what have you. Anyway, and so in prepping for that hot take, I just was kind of writing out a bunch of a key part of the tweets that we use to examine our discussion on the difference between the legal regime of free speech and then the culture of free speech, and how they are complementary but distinct, different kind of paradigms. Was this notion of, kind of drawing critical distinctions on the issue of free speech. So just that triggered me to come up with my own list of nuanced distinctions that could be grist for the mill, you might say, of future such discussions. And it was actually in my exercise of creating that list of kind of polarities, if you will, that it kind of just popped out. It wasn't the first one I came up with, but as I was making the list of other pairings, which I think I actually ran through in that hot take, so that's a plug to go back and look if you want to hear the whole list. Then it kind of came to me, just censuring versus censoring. And in my best writing moments, I do hit upon something approaching eloquence, and literary kind of tone. So that one I was particularly proud of because it had a kind of nice alliterative and poetic kind of framing to it. So we thought that that would be a good kind of follow on topic to riff off of for tonight's hot take. And in particular, it's been about a month and a half, maybe even 2 months now, since even some of the aftermath events. But definitely just even picking back up on that theme of people getting canceled for celebrating murder and all of that. And then there was the Jimmy Kimmel cancellation kerfuffle, or kind of wannabe cancellation. He didn't even get canceled. He's back on air. So, and the kind of counter outrage that arose primarily on the political left in reaction to that, and just all the both nonsense and confusion surrounding that. And I would say there's been residual kind of aftermath events that have just trickled on in the 2 months since then, that continue to kind of give rise to this issue of censuring versus censoring. So I guess I'll just kind of continue on. And to me, I think the critical distinction, and it kind of analogizes to that notion of the legal regime versus the cultural regime of free speech, is that censoring, especially when we want to talk about it and think about it in a free speech context, censoring, which I will put in the bad category, the thing we don't want as philosophical liberals and aiming for a free society, is when the government uses its monopoly of force power to forcibly silence an individual's speech and thoughts. That is what censoring is. And I think it's important that we draw that clear distinction, that it's both the government being the actor and then the force being the mechanism through which they prevent the speech. So to me, those are kind of two of the critical pieces of censoring. And then censuring, you could, by that definition of the censoring, you could say is everything else, any other form of kind of disapproval, uh, sanction, consequence, whatever, that's meted out to people for things they say or think, but that are done by either private actors and entities and institutions, or that use means other than physical force or the threat thereof, to kind of suppress someone's speech and ideas. So just even kind of definitionally, that's kind of how I think of the distinction. But we can maybe then get into just some of the ramifications or implications of that distinction, certainly that I have in my own mind in thinking about it. But I'll pause there to let you kind of react.
Well, and I definitely want to ask you a question about this, but but first, I even wanted to make a point that one of the first things that came to my mind when I heard you make that distinction was that this ties in so beautifully with one of the key attributes of free speech and what a free speech culture is all about, and part of the value of free speech, which is thinking about the connection between our freedom of speech and our freedom of association. And free speech obviously gets a lot of press from both the left and the right and a lot of the media. We don't necessarily pay as much attention to freedom of association, but it is just as important, if perhaps not more, of an important right that we have as Americans and as citizens of a free society. And to me, these two, free speech and freedom of association, are so closely linked, because part of the value to me of free speech is that it gives us the knowledge and information we need to make wise choices about our association, that we want to be able to hear people's speech to be able to get a sense of who they are as human beings. What do they stand for? What are their views on certain topics? So that we can exercise our freedom of association to say, this is someone that we want to be part of our organization, part of what our company stands for, or not. And in this particular instance, to me, one of the things that was so heartbreaking, clearly, Charlie Kirk was very much a political figure, but he was a human being first. And as someone who does not identify with either the traditional right or left, but who absolutely identifies as a human being, I saw just the tragedy of the sadness of a human being assassinated in this horrific way for their speech, whatever side this person was speaking on, whether he was speaking for the left or the right. And to my sense of morality, I do think that part of the culture of free speech is that there's a moral place to say, for any organization to say, we hold human life to be sacred. We hold the dignity of a human being to be sacred. And there is no place in our organization to celebrate or mock the death of a human being, regardless of politics. And that to me would be a clear moral example where I think censure would be appropriate. Certainly, as someone, as an entrepreneur, someone building my own company, thinking about some of the values that I would want to instill in my company or think about what my company would stand for, that is absolutely something that I would want my company to stand for. I would want us to have this respect for human life, for a human being, regardless of political affiliation. And so that I could see reasons to censure anyone who might mock the tragic death of an individual. But that also then makes a clear distinction between censoring. But now this kind of gets into the question I wanted to ask you, because here you clearly put censoring in the camp of the legal side of free speech, and what you said I would absolutely agree with. But I'm curious if you also see something, as we're trying to dig out the nuances here, is
Hmm.
there something you would see as morally problematic with censoring in terms of the culture of free speech? Like, is there still a distinction between censoring and censuring? Especially since we've kind of made this distinction that censoring is something we want to avoid, and censuring is something that we want to encourage. We want people to speak out. We
Yeah.
want to live in a culture where shame is an operative method.
Yes.
It's a good thing for a society to uphold values and to shame people who go outside of those values when we're clear on what some of those values are. But so I'm curious if you still see if there is a distinction, or if there's a kind of censoring in the culture of freedom of speech realm that you would find problematic, or do you see it as just clearly this bright line of this is a legal issue versus a cultural?
Yeah, at the risk of oversimplifying and being overly didactic, I think it is this bright line test, and I think it provides even a nice, simple heuristic, if you will, and certainly at least a conceptual clarity to help people kind of keep the categories distinct. Because frankly, one of I think the issues that gave rise for the need to draw out this nuance and distinction, taking the Jimmy Kimmel example as a prime example, was that people were calling what his employer was doing to him as an example of censoring, when in fact they were very clear in their statements. Singtel and Nexstar, whatever the syndicates, the TV syndicates that came out with the statement and took him off the air in the aftermath of his heinous and completely defamatory and fallacious statements on Charlie's murderer, that they were doing it because they were morally outraged by it, and so. And then, of course, all of his defenders, particularly political partisans on the left, who saw it as some kind of form of, Republican or Trump inspired retaliation, just immediately jumped to saying censoring. Now, I will grant with an asterisk that the FCC chairman did come out and make a ham handed statement about it. And, there's a whole kind of sub discussion to be had about that and the FCC's powers. Legally, they have, whether you agree with them or not, they have been upheld by the Supreme Court over a century's now worth of case law. So if you are a free speech advocate, an absolutist, then that's a whole other issue to be solved. So, even teasing apart what legally, whether the government was acting inappropriately or not from the legal standard, that's an open debate. But the point is, his employer was the primary reason he got pulled off the air, not because of anything that the government said or did. It happened well before even that FCC statement was made. So, point being, what they did to me was an example of censuring, not censoring, because, as you noted, as his employer, they have the right of freedom of association. And I would say censuring also speaks to the right of other people's free speech, just as those people who make controversial or offensive statements have the right to do it. So too do all the rest of us have the right to speak out, including by using your material or economic or property rights and associative, community influences to speak against, someone's rights. And I think that that is the mechanism through which culture enforces those standards and morals and mores that you reference. So to me, I think it is important to keep that line bright, because you know in my view, as long only the government really has the power to definitively silence someone from speaking. And that to me is what censoring properly defined equals, is kind of taking away the capacity for someone to use their voice and share their mind. But other than the government, who has that monopoly on the force power, there's really no there's really no means in which an individual could be completely silenced other than someone killing them, which of course that's the whole separate. So I guess you could say that's another form of censoring that would happen in the private sphere, if someone, just kind of a private citizen or organization, took up arms against someone to silence them. So that is, I guess, so maybe the government isn't the only actor, but any actor. The government, I think, is the primary one we want to be concerned about when dealing with the free society and upholding both the culture and legality of free speech, where censoring matters. But yeah, primarily, I think every other example in the culture of free speech would be censuring. And then that's where you get into the nuances of what are the different types of censuring that individuals and organizations can mete out to ideas they disagree with, and what are the appropriate contexts in which that can happen. I mean, I think that will get into a separate conversation, which we can save for another hot take, about so-called cancel culture, the other things, because some would argue, well, that's just a form of censuring, so what's wrong with that? And there are nuanced debates. I think this was another on my list of polarities of truth versus falsity, and kind of good values versus bad values. I think those are implicated in the question of cancel culture and its appropriateness. But suffice to say that insofar as cancel culture is a form of censuring, then yes, that is, in my view, it's part of the culture of free speech. And then this is where the nuances of when and what type of censuring action are appropriate, that's where you need these types of distinctions and nuances to be drawn, because then you can focus on that discussion versus kind of a confusion about whether what's happening is even an example of censoring in the first place.
Well, I know we want to keep these short, but we're definitely going to have to pick this up for another conversation because I'm going to be really curious to hear then some of your reactions, and I might have a slightly different opinion. I mean, I definitely agree with what you're saying here in the legal realm, but I think there are also important distinctions when we're thinking about upholding the value of a culture of free speech. What comes to mind right away is anyone who's watching this knows we're on the Dissidents channel here of the ILV podcast. This Dissidents channel got started precisely because of several dissidents in academia who were speaking out in, I think, what they would have identified as a censorious culture, a culture where, in this instance, let's say it would be an academic culture where there was a kind of expectation that one should have freedom to speak widely, say from a variety of political opinions, but yet these people felt that they were being silenced because of their political views. So I don't think we'll save this because it could be a very long discussion, and maybe it's even just a teaser for the next session, and maybe that really is the question. Maybe is even bringing up this topic of cancel culture and what is the culture of free speech, and maybe what are some of these distinctions between the censoring and censuring within an organization. Do we want to call out an organization for being too censorious? Maybe is that even a word? I know
Yeah,
censorious is a
I think
word, but
that's good. Yeah.
yes,
Hmm.
but is that even the distinction we want to make? But it'll be
That's
a whole long discussion, I think, and one I think that we'll carry out through, I think, examining several examples and future topics, and I'm looking
for su
forward to it.
for sure, likewise, and the only comment I'll make there is that, I while I grant the moral legitimacy and even necessity of censuring as a tool in the cultural toolkit, I also, for the concern that you're highlighting of not creating a culture that is overly censorious or sorious, so to speak, that I think it's a tool that we want to use wisely and sparingly. And
Mhm.
so that was, I guess, maybe the point I was trying to make ineloquently right before, was that to me is where the benefit of drawing a bright line between what is censorious versus censorious
Mhm.
conduct is important, because I think most people across the ideological spectrum are generally against censoring, certainly at least when it's their views. Um, so, so I think if you can at least separate the debates over whether something is an act of censoring or not, then you can start to focus on the more nuanced but probably more important debate that we need to have in terms of building a culture of free speech on when and what types of censuring is it appropriate to use in what context.
And perhaps when do we want to censure the censorious ones among us?
Yeah. Well said. Good way to end it, and make it poetic to end where we began.
Yes. Well, I'll be looking forward to more of these, so we'll pick it up next time.
Likewise. Thanks.
See you
Thanks.
then.
See you then.